Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Gay with God podcast, a safe place for us to share our stories and support one another. How long did we know? What challenges did we face? Did we lose our faith? When did we find our way back home? Or are we still searching? The stories you hear on this podcast will melt your heart and strengthen your belief that in God, all things are possible, and you can be authentically gay with the God of your understanding. I am your host, Midge Noble, and I am very honored that you are here. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Gay with God podcast. I'm so glad that you're here, and I have a guest for you that I'm so delighted to bring to you. Reverend Phillip Bass is the founding priest of the beloved community at the Trees in Durham, North Carolina. This is a community dedicated to providing healing ministries outside of a traditional church setting, especially for those who have experienced religious trauma. Phillip previously served as the Associate Rector of the Church of the Nativity in Raleigh, North Carolina. In addition to his pastoral role, Phillip is also a licensed clinical mental health counselor and has a private practice in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Go Heels. Okay, sorry. In his clinical work, he often works with the LGBTQIA plus community, religious trauma, relationships, and others. I'm delighted to bring you Phillip because we met probably a year ago, I think,
Something like
at
that.
at the Diocesan Convention, and we had a brief little conversation, and then we reconnected again this past year. And now we're in a beautiful community of like-minded fellow travelers through the world in the LGBTQ community. And I'm so glad that we're able to share that space together because it's really, really spiritual and really comforting. And now I have a new friend and I can find out all the stuff that you're doing down at the trees and stuff. So welcome to the
Thank
show.
you. Thank you. Thanks for having me and for the time. Um, and likewise, it's great to have community of
Yes.
fellow travelers who are queer and Christian and trying to understand the world we live in today. And I'm so glad
Mm-hmm.
that we've had this chance to reconnect and spend more
Yes.
time together. And
Yes.
I was listening to some of your podcasts and thinking, wow, I wish I had these when I was coming out.
Oh,
When I
thank
was
you.
wrestling
Aw.
with my faith and wrestling with what I thought God believed and what I've been told, and
Mm-hmm.
to have these voices would have been so empowering.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you
Yeah,
for everything
you're
you're doing.
welcome. Well, thank you for that. And that's exactly why I wanted to do the podcast. It's the reason I wrote my memoir because I didn't have any of that, also. And it's important for people who have gone through the religious trauma and have come on the other side. I think it's really important for us to share. I feel like that's a ministry that we both have that, we
Right.
can share what we've been through and how we came out the other side. So tell us your story.
My story. Well, that's such an open-ended question, right? There's so many
Yeah.
ways. Um, but on this topic, I grew up like you listed several places in North Carolina. North Carolina is home for me. Grew up Methodist, in a church founded by a circuit rider, if you know Methodist language, right? So old Methodist. And to my understanding, the church I grew up in is now the oldest, still in operation Methodist church in the Western Conference of North Carolina.
Wow.
Deep-rooted Methodist roots and very active in church. My family tells the story. I don't remember it. Once I told them I was going to seminary, they said, "Well, you told us that when you're in middle school." Apparently, they all have a memory of being at my grandparents' table on a Sunday
Wow.
after church and me saying, "I'm going to be a Methodist language. I'm going to be a preacher," right? And
Hmm.
I have no recollection of that, none at all.
Wow.
So very deep Methodist roots. And like most people, then I stepped away in college. I still had faith, but I was doing other things, right? It was
Hmm.
college at
Hmm.
Carolina. Go Heels. I'm glad you said that. I thought that. I appreciate that. And strange, in this context, it may sound strange, but at the time, it was my life. I
Hmm.
married the woman I was dating at UNC. We got married a month after we graduated,
Oh.
and we were married for a few years, about 5 years total. And the marriage, we did all the things that you're supposed to do. Got married. We ha purchased our first house on the other side of Chapel Hill, out towards Graham, and had our careers started working at UNC. and then the marriage fell apart.
Oh.
And it was a time in which much of my theology, much of my belief system was really ripped apart.
Mm-hmm.
Doing all the right things. I had done the right things. I was taking care of people. I was going to church. We had found a small little Methodist church that we were attending, right? And without realizing it, and because I didn't have the language at the time, and it's not a theology I grew up with, but somewhere that prosperity gospel had really taken hold. Do the right things and good things will happen,
Right.
right? I can look back now and see that that was God freeing me to do other things.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't what I was supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so part of what folks talk about is, when did you come out? It's a question I ask all the time in my clinical practice. I ask four questions that tell me a lot about how deep-seated someone's trauma is. When did you know you were different? When did you name it to yourself? When did you tell someone else? And when did you first act on it? When did you go on a date
Mm-hmm.
or something like that? And when I think about that question for myself, when did you know you were gay? Boy, that's a hard one to answer. Right? It was more of an evolving
Mm-hmm.
awareness. And I
Mm-hmm.
do think there's the genetic part of us that's who we are, but we need the environment to give us space to be
Yes.
there.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the marriage fell apart. Everything that I thought I was doing right, that I wanted in life, was suddenly crumbling. And around that same time, I started getting these signs. I would be driving down the road, or I'd be mowing the yard, and suddenly I would realize I was writing a sermon in my head. And I'm like, where is this coming from? Why am I writing sermons in my head? No, I don't. What is this? Or, I always say, growing up Methodist, I could tell you the stories. I'm not a Baptist. I don't know chapter and verse, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know the stories. But I would be, again, just in the middle of my day, and suddenly this scripture would pop in my head, and I would go right to it in the Bible somehow,
Wow.
right? So I started wrestling with that, and what this is, and those kind of things, and then more and more awareness started to happen. And so a couple of things really clarified two paths, two changes in my life, I will say. I went on a mission trip to Lithuania with my little Methodist church and people I love and adore. And while I was there, multiple times, someone who didn't speak English would come up to me. And one lady in particular, I remember it, it will always live with me. She came up to me and she started patting my chest. She would say, "Preacher, preacher."
Aw.
And no one at the time knew I was wrestling with this call, right? Um, but someone, a Lithuanian on the other side of the world, pointed it
Mm-hmm.
out, right? And there was we stayed in what they called a hotel with communist charm, which meant every other light bulb worked and everything was square. That's kind of what it looked like to me. Um, and there was this little pizza place down in the basement, our lower floor, we would go to and have dinner every night after we'd done our work and everything. And I realized that the waiter was flirting, and I liked it. I'm like, what's going on here? What's going on here? So I came back and immediately went to my director at UNC and said, I'm quitting in a year because I'm going to seminary. I hadn't applied, didn't know what that would look like, but I just knew it was going to happen, right? It's like, and he said, okay, but here's a sermon that um, his Baptist preacher had preached that Sunday. He said, I want you to read it and tell me what you think. It's the same sermon I heard in the Catholic Church in Lithuania. And I'm like, okay, God, I hear you. I hear you, right? And I was still wrestling with other things. And then I had a friend who we had season tickets to Playmakers, the theater on UNC's campus. And we were at dinner, and we were having this moment of, do we date or not? Like, she and I had been friends forever. We were great friends, but we were spending all our time together. And I realized as we're having that conversation, I'm staring at the guy behind her. And I'm like, I got to figure this out.
Yeah.
And with the help of great ministers, with the help of therapy, with the help of friends, with the help of living in Chapel Hill and Carborough, it was pretty safe
Yes.
to do this
Yes.
exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I finally came out to myself. And then I had this wrestling of, what do I do with a call to ministry and a call to authenticity? When
Mm.
the church says my authentic self,
Mm-hmm.
welcome in ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And I got lots of varying advice. Come out and don't go to the church, leave the church, get ordained and don't tell anyone,
Mm,
be celibate, have a partner but keep them somewhere else, which
mm,
sounds horrible to me,
mhm,
and lonely. Um, and so I was still wrestling, and I went in then, did go to Duke the next year, kind of got it open that door, and I went in still in the Methodist discernment process and had my first boyfriend. We were together for 3-ish years, and he was very supportive of this. And I didn't tell anyone my first year,
mm,
except for my small covenant group. We were like
mhm,
4 or 5, and they're the only people in seminary I told. I was out in in my community and my friends by that point, out with my family by that point. But in seminary, no, I wasn't ready, and I
mhm,
wanted to hear partially what I would live, like what would be my lived experience in the church
mhm.
if this were the case.
Right.
And somewhere along that first semester, then I also received a form letter from my district superintendent with all the things. Do you promise this? Do you promise this? And one checkbox was, do you avow that you are not a practicing, I forget the language now that the Methodist Church uses, a practicing
Mhm.
homosexual, right?
Wow.
And that was the moment I had to decide, do I lie or not?
Yep.
And that was the moment I dropped out of the discernment process in the Methodist Church.
Yep.
And yet God had God's call to seminary to ministry was so clear.
Mhm.
Um, and this would have been 2003.
Mm,
So 2000, I finished my MDiv in 2006 and my THM in '09. So this would have been early 2000s, right? Much
mhm,
different time. And so I dropped out of the discernment process,
mhm.
uh, found some Anglican classes. I was confirmed by Bishop Curry into the
Aw.
Episcopal Church. And then the field ed office didn't know what to do with me because like the second year I came out,
Mhm,
right? I took over Sacred Worth and led Sacred Worth, which was the queer, student group. Um, and so they placed me back in a Methodist church, which was at the time the only reconciling Methodist church in North or South Carolina. So
mm,
great, loving people, lots of queer folks, wonderful mentors to this day, wonderful friends to this day. So I kind of landed in this place. Like, am I Methodist? Am I? So I called myself Methapalian for a while. I thought I'll be a little bit of both. And and as Methodists do, much like we do, we gather, and every summer there would be annual conference, and I would
mhm,
see all these people that I was in school with, all these people that I knew, be ordained over and over, and there I sat.
mm,
And one year it just hit me. I can't do this anymore.
mhm,
This is self-harm at this point.
mhm,
And so, but I stayed on. The church I was at, I became part of the staff and worked there again, loved it. Um, but it got to be to the point to step foot in the Methodist church just caused so much pain,
mhm.
right? That I had to leave.
Yep.
And by that point, I had met my husband. We built a house. We lived downtown Raleigh, and then we built a house out in Wake Forest. We started looking for a church, right? Because driving to Durham was getting to be too much, and I was kind of needed some space in the Methodist church. And by that point, ordination was so far off the radar. I just
Mhm,
kind of let it go. I let it go. And we found St. John's in Wake Forest, an Episcopal church. Um, that's where my both my husband and my son were baptized.
aw.
There, fell in love with the Episcopal Church again. Like I said, been confirmed and then back in Methodist, but found my way back to the Episcopal Church. Loved it. Loved the people there. And then because of work and other things, we moved to Durham, and found a parish here,
Mhm,
which we loved, St. Luke's. And we were there for a few years. So I'd probably been a decade into the Episcopal Church as a family, by the point. But I remember a Sunday that my husband, as the wine and bread were lifted, he looked at me and said, "When are you do something about this?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Every time that we get to this point, you're crying."
aw.
I was like, "No, I'm not." He kind of wiped my eyes, like, "Yeah, you are, right?" And he pointed out like this. He's like, "It's not gone. It's still there." And so that led to um, speaking with our deacon, who at the time was the deacon at that church, is the deacon serving with me now. So it's kind of full
Aw.
circle. Who is also a gay man, and it's
Aw.
and Dan said, "We've been waiting on this conversation,"
Oh.
and so very affirming, and so did my discernment there, and then just a couple of years ago, finally ordained as an Episcopal priest, and
Yay.
it's been this journey, right? And
Mm-hmm.
all along the way, there's been this wrestling with what do I do with this thing about being gay
Mm-hmm.
and this call. And I fought for years to not be the priest who focuses on queer folks.
Mm.
It felt like um it is an internalized trauma, right? That
Mm-hmm.
needs us to think that, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
just because I'm gay, I shouldn't only serve gay people. I shouldn't, and it's not that I only serve gay people, but there was a part of me that kept trying to separate it out, kept
Mm-hmm.
trying to separate it out. And then I got to Nativity, where I did my internship, and I was, really blessed to be able to stay on as the associate rector, and work with Stephanie Allen, who's wonderful. And there was this moment where Stephanie was on sabbatical, Jeremy, our formation minister, was there, and I forget who brought it up, Jeremy or myself once, like I've been thinking, like I've been in spirit stirring something here. We need to do something for queer youth, right? And I forget, Jamie said, I said, and whoever the other one was, like, I've been thinking the same thing. Where
Wow.
is this coming? We'll put on hold when Stephanie gets back from sabbatical. We'll see what she thinks. Stephanie was back maybe a day or two. It's like, y'all, while I was away, I kept wrestling with we need to be doing something for queer youth. So God really working, right? And all of
Yeah.
us separately. And then we pulled the statistics from the Trevor Project. And there was
Mm.
this moment when we realized, that once every 45 seconds a queer youth attempts suicide.
Mm-hmm.
That it all came clear. We got it. Yes, this is what God is telling us we need to be focusing on. And so we started this program, True Colors. And the idea was um, to create safe space, support groups for queer youth, right? Programs for queer youth. We got more volunteers than we knew what to do with, and no queer people showed up.
Yep.
Part of that, I also, there's a training I teach in my practice, and it's on relationships, queer relationships, and heteronormative and cisnormative trauma, and how that changes our body so much that it's hard to relate sometimes between queer people in romantic relationships,
Mm.
right? Our shame and our trauma plays out against each other. And I had folks tell me this, like, and we were going to offer this at Nativity to the community as a ministry. And I had queer folks say, no, I'll come pay you and sit in your office, but I'm not going to take it. I'd rather do that than have it for free in a church.
Wow.
And it really, those kind of moments started to bring back together. Maybe my ministry is to reconcile people to God who have been hurt by the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, um, the beloved community has been around for a year now. We just celebrated our first anniversary a couple of weeks ago. The fall before that, I started having those 3 a.m. wake ups. So we'd had this experience at Nativity where, the drive, the excitement among the volunteers was there. Queer people wouldn't show up. I've been teaching some queer theology. I've been preaching more from queer theology as well. And then I started these 3 a.m. wake ups. I call them the God time. And God's like, hey, you're
Yep.
not going to, I got something to tell you.
Yep.
And started wrestling with what it was, and then started conversations with Bishop and conversations with St. Philip's and other priests. And the trees was available. And with Bishop Sam's blessing, he said, go figure this out. Go, you have my blessing. Go try this. Right. And so
Wow.
started this idea of creating a space of worship to build community for people who won't step foot in a church, right?
Mm-hmm.
Intentionally focused on practices to recover from religious trauma, and very upfront about being welcoming and affirming for queer people. And we're now a year in, and so I've moved from this place of I need to keep these things separate to it is very much the core of the
Mm-hmm.
ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And God has worked that out in some amazing ways.
That's, I just love that story because, you know, the struggle and the angst that you had and the crushing disappointment that that must have been to leave seminary after all that time. Um, it just shows the resilience not only of you, but the constant connection that the Holy Spirit and God has with us, and that it doesn't matter how long we go on that journey, God is present and always providing what we need if we can pay
It
attention.
is. It is. And even in seminary, and to be clear, I didn't leave seminary. I stayed. I left the
Okay.
method.
You mess you mess so when you said you left the
The,
preaching,
the discernment process. I dropped
okay.
out of that Methodist ordination
Okay.
process. Stayed in seminary. I
Thank
actually did
you.
a master's in divinity, and I also then stayed and did a master's in theology where I focused on sex, gender, and the church,
Awesome.
and looking at how the separation of body and spirit is really damaging to us, right? In a lot of
Mm-hmm.
theology, especially among queer people and women. So that
Mm-hmm.
was kind of my focus there. And so I stayed,
Yeah.
but yeah, that sense of God being active even through community. So I mentioned that core group of friends, my covenant
Mm-hmm.
group, who I still are some of the best friends I have. The only ones who knew, right? The first year. And my first year, first semester at Duke, even, I remember in chapel, someone preaching, we need to get the queer people out of church and call us sin what
Oh.
it is. And people applauding.
Oh.
Well, it's come a long way, right?
Yeah.
Um, But by the end of that year, me not realizing how much it had taken a toll on me not understanding how
Mm-hmm.
depressed I was, but having those people who knew and said, we're walking you over to the counseling center. This
Mm-hmm.
isn't healthy for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was God. God through
Yeah.
community,
Yes.
caring, right? Through people
Mm-hmm.
who loved me for who I authentically was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I do think that was God.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Because I believe that we are the hands and feet of Jesus and that
exactly,
we're doing what Jesus would still be doing if, he were still here. And so I think it
exactly,
takes each of us to be open vessels to minister to the other people that need it and
right,
to receive what we need. Because
right.
none of us have made it all the way.
No, no. Well, and a beautiful part of this God story. So that would have been early 2000s, right? Applauding when let's call out the sin of homosexuality. I sat in Richard Hayes' class, right? In Richard Hayes' book with the whole chapter condemning homosexuality at the
Mm,
time.
mm,
Fast forward to, I believe it was 3 years ago, I was invited to teach spiritual formation at Duke for the queer students.
wow.
We focused on queer theology, right?
Yeah.
Um, Talk about God working some things out.
Yeah.
From
Yeah.
a place where I was one of maybe three or four out students. I knew others. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I went through at a time when even when we met at Sacred Worth, people would put paper over the window
Oh,
in the door because somebody would walk by and take down the names to turn into the district superintendents.
oh, good grief.
From
Wow.
that to come teach a class for our queer students.
That's amazing.
God is good, right? And that
Yeah,
is
all
God
the time.
all the time. Yeah.
Even when we don't know it. Because there's a lot of questions for people, and I totally embrace the idea of questions. And when I first came to the Episcopal
Yes.
Church, I asked a bazillion jillion questions, and Father
Good.
Joe was
Good.
so patient with me because I was always asking things. And so I needed to know for sure. I'd been out of church for so long, and this was my very awkward, resistant way to get back in. And I wanted answers before I committed again and had my heart broken.
I get it. I get it. And that's so much of the work we're doing out at the beloved community,
Hmm.
right? For folks who have come from theologies that said, you have to know the right answers to get into heaven. You can't ask questions. This is the truth,
Yeah.
right? We
Hmm.
often talk about the difference in knowing and believing, right? And
Hmm.
knowing is a head activity, believing is a heart activity.
Hmm.
And we talk a lot about believing is living the questions, is it's living with the doubt. It is living with that relationship with God, not believing that we know everything about God.
Mm.
Um, and that offers space for so much healing for people.
Hmm. Yes. Yes. Well, and I think the religious trauma part, I mean, that's somebody asked me yesterday, one of my when I was in the writing process and we had a group that met and she called and she says, "So how's your book doing?" And I'm like, "Well, it has made an impact in some people's lives. And she said, "Well, that's great." And I said, "Yes." And we both paused and she said, "Yeah, that's about the same for mine." And you know, and I said, "Well, I said I live in the South, in the reddest little place that you can be."
We do.
And I said, I'm in the tween because people hate me because I'm gay and I'm an abomination. The queer people are not always happy with me because I bailed out and went back to this religious place. And I said, so, even one of the in Greensboro, they have the big center for the LGBTQ folks,
Right.
and I wanted to come and talk about my book and talk about religious drama, and they're like, no, we're not into that. And
Hmm.
even I'm like, I
But
was I was dismissed by my own people.
it's so true, right? It's and
Yeah.
it is the church who has caused that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even in my clinical practice, when I maybe get a call from a potential client, once they identify that they are queer, I always kind of have to throw in the warning. I need you to know I'm an ordained priest
Yeah.
because that may be harmful to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not that I
Mm-hmm.
would be harmful, but
Yes.
just being in presence of
Yep.
someone, that title,
Yep.
right,
Mm-hmm.
can be really triggering for folks.
Yes. Yes.
Right? And what I
Yep.
found most often is people will say, "Well, that's why I called," because they're trying to work out some of that wrestling, right, between
Yeah.
what they believe and what they've been told.
Yes, yes. And I think that more people are really seeking the spirituality and they're seeking that relationship with the God of their understanding, but they don't always know what that's going to be. And
Right.
they wrestle so much with the God that we were preached at about. And that is such a inner homophobia kind of
It
trigger,
really
is
is.
that, and that's why I called my everything that I do gay with God, because I couldn't say the word God for the longest time without
Yeah.
absolutely hating that word. And
Mhm.
so by reclaiming that, by honoring that, and knowing that the journey I took got me to this exact moment, you know, God was present and I had to
Right.
honor that.
I get that. That's been my journey with the word queer,
Mm,
right? Is and I use it with intentionality. And when I would preach and use that word, it never failed. Someone's like, "I don't like that. We were told that's a bad word. We were told," and I was like,
hmm.
"Yes, because it's a word that has power, and I refuse to let anyone take that power from me anymore.
Good for you.
God made me queer, and if you're going to use that word against me, I'm going to claim it and celebrate
That's
the
right.
power God gave me,
That's
right?"
right. Yes, yes. And when we start to dismantle that, then we start to release some of that inner homophobia and we don't have to hang on to it anymore because it doesn't work on us anymore.
Right. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. And then I think it empowers us. So one of the things that I'm working on with the committee in our diocese
Hmm.
um, is a little booklet that about half of it should be ready by June for Pride Month, and then the full thing by our next convention. But this is a booklet to put in the hands of queer people. This is not a
Hmm.
study for allies. This is not a study to get comfortable with gay people being in your parish, right? This is a,
Hmm.
a a booklet. We're working with a graphic artist to put in the hands of gay people to show that we've always been in Scripture. We've
Mm.
always been part of God's story. So there's David and Jonathan, there's Ruth and Naomi, there is Lazarus being told as a coming out story. There's wrestling
Mm.
with Jacob as an understanding of a transgender experience, coming out with a new name, a changed body, and blessing,
Hmm.
right? The other side of wrestling with God.
Hmm.
Um, and there's, I think there's eight, nine stories we're telling,
Hmm.
creation, which is an anti-binary story. The binary is the bookends of everything, right? And
Hmm.
that is what creation tells us. So I'm really looking forward to that coming out to be a
Hmm.
furthering of what the church is working on in terms of healing and helping
Hmm.
queer folks recognize you've always been part of God's creation.
Yep. It's so sad, isn't it, that it's taking this long for churches to be open and to see how that all fit together and that we are not the abomination and that it was a mistranslation and you know we've we've suffered a
Right.
long time with that. However, the tide is turning and I just hope that this current administration doesn't turn it backwards. We are all like just holding our breath.
We are,
We are.
and I don't know about you. I was telling my spiritual director earlier today that it has actually deepened my relationship with God.
Mm,
One of the things I am making, and I say making myself do, is pray for the occupant of the White House every day. And that is not an easy task.
No,
What I'm learning is that praying for him is actually strengthening my relationship with God.
that's beautiful.
And and I've never really understood fully, and I probably still don't. There's a lifetime of learning ahead what it means to pray for your enemies.
Hmm. Well, see, and I had just talked about that on the podcast the other day because, we had talked about that um and I did make an effort and I need to continue that effort because as soon as I started making an effort, you get to test it. And more bad
Right.
things happened. And I'm like, it is very difficult. But I also know that there are so many people who have been on difficult journeys and resilience and joy and and as we talked about, or you just talked about that is bringing you closer to God, and that joy within you will continue to feed you through this process.
I think so. And the way I've been able to pray for him is probably not separated from our journey as queer people. If I put on my counseling, my psychological hat, I look at the behavior and think this man has never known what it feels like to be loved.
Yep,
And I can empathize and feel sorry for him.
yep,
I may not like what he's doing, and I still may curse the things that he is doing to people.
yes.
But I can pray that God opens his heart to understand what it feels like to be loved.
Mm, mm,
Right. And
yep,
I think part of me really does think that's because we as queer people have longed to know what it feels like to be loved.
yeah. And we know what it feels like to not. And when you say it that way, that makes so much more sense. And that's where I found compassion for him
Mhm.
when I was trying to mend my rage with him. Is that
It's okay to
so,
rage. We have that
so
too.
much rage, so
So much
much
rage.
rage. Oh my gosh. Um, and I'm an Aries, so I've got it like infernally rage. So it was that I know as a counselor of children back in the day is that trauma happens and changes children, and they can only survive by pushing away, especially
Right.
reactive attachment children. And
Mhm.
so if he was not ever connected to his birth mom, if he always had to try to find love, then you're absolutely right. He's going to be, pushing that back and having his own internal rage toward
Right.
everybody that represents love
Right.
because he never had it. So I could find compassion for him for that. And I was doing really well with it until the election. And then it's been a little backslide. And then I tried to
Not easy.
revive it.
Yeah, it's not easy.
But that is the work though. That is the work to know that we're not perfect and that we can have our emotions and we can have our rage and we can have our questions and we can still continue to move toward what God is asking us to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, once we, excuse me, once we allow ourselves to be loved, which is a hard
Hmm.
thing for queer people, pulling from
Hmm.
some of my research that I do in my practice and pulling from queer theory, right? We show up in higher proportions in helping professions and in family caregiving.
Hmm.
It is so closely associated to the fact that we grew up so desperate for that love
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yep.
What we know is when we are performative, when we are closeting ourselves, pretending we're something other, our bodies won't receive that love anyway.
Right.
There's a quote I use when I'm teaching relationship workshops that the loneliest place you can be is sitting next to the person you love when they're in love with your performance.
Wow.
And I think every queer person knows that experience. If
Mm-hmm.
I misstep, if I do something wrong,
Hmm.
love may go away. Well, if that's the case,
Hmm.
it was never real love anyway,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so I do think, coming back to bringing back then together ministry and our queer experience, I think that shifts things theologically in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
I think it invites us to bring others into an authentic sense of who they are.
Hmm.
Right? That God doesn't ask you to be perfect, God asks you to be you,
Yes.
so that you can be perfect in God. Right. And that is a huge shift, I think, for a lot of people, depending on where they've
Hmm.
come from theologically.
Yes. Yeah. And that is the gift. I mean, that is the gift to be imperfect and know that God is perfect within you.
Right. right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to be perfect. One, to be boring, and
I
two,
know.
it's such a small space to live in, right? And there's no growth there.
Yes. Wow. So in your personal story, did you lose people?
I did, yeah. Um, the one friend I mentioned
Mm-hmm.
who we were would see the theater together, definitely lost.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Most of my friends, including a lot of people who were at my wedding, it's like, oh, we just been waiting on you to realize this, and
Oh.
celebrated it, right?
Mm-hmm.
My mother's side of the family, accepting, welcoming, loving, never batted an eye. I had to end my relationship with my father.
Did you?
Yes. It had been a challenging, not in the sense of butting heads or anything like that, but we just never could really connect.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I came out, got married to my husband, adopted, and my son is not white.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we tried to reconnect. We tried to spend more time together, and then there was two posts back to back on social media. One was racist, and one was homophobic.
Mm.
And so I called him, and we had about an hour long talk. And at the end of it, came to the conclusion that it was the end of our relationship.
Oh.
And we both ended up saying we loved each other, but I said I can't keep doing this. It's
Mm-hmm.
not healthy for me and my family, and I'm going to protect my child.
Yeah.
And we ended, right. He could not call my husband my husband. He would be my friend,
Oh.
right?
Oh.
Was more focused on the work he had done to tolerate who I was than accept who I was.
Mm.
Um, in that conversation, and the really sad part is about 10 months later he died suddenly. And
Did he?
so we never reconciled. And I use this story quite often when I'm preaching because I think that is the scripture that talks about the sword of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes love looks like distance, right?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And that's what I could love him from afar. I could
Mm-hmm.
not be present and still love him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say I still love him in different ways. And I know that we will be reconciled someday, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
like our baptism and covenant says, we'll be reconciled with God's help. We couldn't do
Mm-hmm.
it.
Right.
I firmly believe with all my heart that God will reconcile us when the time is right.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a difficult thing for people to be able to do because they're so, like you said before, we all want to be loved. And so we accept sometimes less than we deserve just to stay in community with our families because, you know, even though they may not love us the way we want to be loved, they're still staying in community with us in some weird way, but it's not healthy. It's just not
Right.
healthy. And it's a difficult time to figure out when is the time to say enough is enough
Mhm.
and let it lay on them and they can come and connect with us when they're ready. And
Right.
I'd done that with my brother at one point. It got really super, super ugly. And I finally said, listen, when you decide to love me, because he had excommunicated me from the kids and wouldn't let me come, and I was going to taint the children and all this kind of stuff. And I said, when you're ready to love me the way I deserve to be loved, my arms are going to be open to you and I will hug you. Until then, I'm not going to be abused by you anymore. And 7 years,
Wow.
7 years, and then one Christmas, we couldn't even go in and see Mama at the same time. We had to make
Oh,
sure
wow.
that we went on different days. Because I wasn't supposed to be around the children. And so one Christmas, I showed up on my day, and my brother opened the door and scared the crap out of me, really, because he
Sure.
went to hug me, and I wondered, is there a knife in your hand? I don't really know. But he hugged me, and it was so awkward
Sure.
because the tension that day was just so awkward. And yet, even when I tried to talk to him about, so what changed? What happened? Did you know that I was going to be here? Yeah, yeah, I knew. I was waiting for you. And it was like so flippant, and he didn't even think that anything had happened, or he didn't admit it. And so I tried to talk to him about it because, I don't need to talk about it, and I just want you in my life.
Hmm.
And so I'm like, but I need to talk about it. I need to
Right.
process it. I need to get in there. But I decided that I wanted to welcome him the way I told him I would. And if we talked about it, we would talk about it. And if we didn't, we wouldn't. I wrote my memoir. He has his own special chapter in it, but I didn't go into a lot of the trauma of that because we had worked, we had gotten
Mhm.
back into it. So I think it just depends on the individual as to what is that line.
I think so.
And I'm so respectful of what you did and to have the courage and to also do what was right for your son. That's
And,
beautiful.
and that really was the final thing, I think, is
Hmm.
not letting it become intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
I'm going to protect my son and cut this here. Because
Yes.
if not, it would have passed on and it would continue passing on.
Yes. Yes. Brilliant. Good for you.
Thank
Well,
you.
let's
Thank you
let's
too.
yay. So let's talk a little bit about, we have just a little bit of time left, but I want to talk about the beloved community at the trees and
Yeah.
how people can find you if they need you. What is the way to get in to to come? Talk a little bit about that.
Anyone is welcome. And, our website is belovedcommunitydurham.org. There's all the information there. Um, we meet on Sunday evenings. So we're intentional about not being at church time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not an
Mm-hmm.
11 o'clock hour thing. And part of that is that's how people's lives tend to be now. Lots of
Yeah.
sports are on Sunday mornings and other things. And our ministry is not to ever be a church, not to be a parish, right? But to be a community of healing. So we have folks who go to their normal parish. They sit in their pew like they do every Sunday morning. Then they come worship with us on Sunday night to do their
Oh,
healing work, right?
nice.
And so it's almost, well, it's not almost, we do consider ourselves a ministry to the diocese and to the community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we work with other parishes to say, who do you have folks who could do some healing work? Send them here. And people are.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, so we meet at 5 o'clock on Sunday evenings for worship with Eucharist. Um, we begin each of our worships by blessing the water that sits in the center of our circle and remembering our baptism. And we talk about that in baptism, we are all one. There is no gay, straight,
Mm-hmm.
black, white, Democrat, Republican. We are one body in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I do the actual blessing, but we all put our hands in the water together. It's
Mm-hmm.
a very hands-on, open to participation community and the way we do our liturgy. Um, and so we start with that. And then, we have Eucharist and um, I don't lift up the bread and wine. When it comes time to present the consecrated element, two people from the community will come forward. It's often children, and they will hold them up and show them to everyone while I say the gifts of God for the people of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we serve one another in community. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a procession to come forward. We do it as a body.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't preach. We have a lectionary discussion, creating as many spaces as we can for people who have been harmed to find their voice again, to share their story, to ask their questions, like you were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we finish with our worship, we go into a simple meal.
Mm-hmm.
In the winter we have soup and bread. In the summer we have salad and bread.
Mm-hmm.
Very simple meal, and it is so healing to sit around a table with people who are forming community together
That's
and
beautiful.
loving each other in such amazing ways. When I say love, I don't use that word lightly, but I get to
Mm-hmm.
watch the care. Like, "Oh, here's this book I told you about," or let's
Mm-hmm.
get a coffee so I can check in on you. Those kind of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? Real love that's in action
Mm-hmm.
happening.
Mm-hmm.
We since we began last year, we now have two support groups. Every other Sunday, I lead the support group for religious trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and the alternating, our deacon leads the support group for parents, families, and friends of queer youth.
Mm, nice.
Learning in community how to be supportive of queer youth, but bringing in some supportive theology as part of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And my real big dream, I think I want to say is to this year start not a support group, a youth group for queer youth, specifically for queer youth, because we know that queer bodies relax around other queer bodies. We can
Mm-hmm.
be our more authentic selves. We can breathe. We take deeper
Mm-hmm.
breaths around one another than we do when we're not. Right?
Yep.
We want to create a space where queer youth can learn that God loves them now instead of someone having to clean it up for them down the road.
Right.
And that
Right.
is the dream of this year.
That's so cool. I love all of that. That's
I'm
so
having a
cool.
great time.
I bet
And,
you
and,
are.
and it is a community of grandparents of trans folks, parents of trans folks, some queer folks, some
Hmm.
straight folks. Um, there's a preschooler and folks who are well retired. I won't call their age. But it's a small little community, right?
Uh-huh.
We're a year in, and I would say core group of 20 or so, right? And we may
Hmm.
have nine on a Sunday, we may have 18, right? It ebbs and flows, and people are,
Hmm.
we're on the, I can feel it kind of in my bones, and it's starting to happen. The next big jump, it's coming, right?
Uh-huh.
And emails with questions from ex-evangelicals or ministers from other denominations are starting to show up in my inbox.
Ah,
And so God is still forming something.
yep. Yep. Well, I have no doubt. I have no doubt that God is working big things for you guys because, you have opened yourself up and you have made yourself available and God is not done. God is
No,
not done speaking, and this world more now than ever needs community like what you're describing and a place to just come and be safe and to
right.
know that they're going to be loved.
Yeah. And I think you'll appreciate this. Our largest attendance was Pride Sunday.
Nice.
And I think we
Nice.
had 36 in this little room
Wow.
it holds about 16 comfortably, and 36 were there. And it was beautiful. The
Mm-hmm.
spirit was present. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's one of the things we're looking forward to again this year is Pride Sunday and really celebrating God's diversity.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Awesome. All of that. All of that and more.
Yeah.
And when this book that you're talking about is fully developed and ready, what do you think would be the way to get that people would get it and access that?
Once we have it, I will definitely have a link on the Beloved
Okay.
Community website.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming the diocese will as well. It should be ready by convention, so anyone who's going to be at convention should be able to grab a copy or two.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and then I think, in our
Mm-hmm.
diocesan group we're in for queer
Uh-huh.
folk, we'll be
Uh-huh.
spreading the word there as well.
Okay,
Once it's
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
And
you know,
and
and
we may need to have you back so that you can talk more about that.
oh, I'd be happy to, right? And
Awesome.
we really want to have them ready by Pride because I think I've shared with
Yes.
you, when I want to share this idea with others in case they're interested. We hope to have, mom hugs,
Mm-hmm.
the moms who show up at Pride and
Yep.
just give that love that we all need.
Yep.
We have a group of priests signing up to do priest blessings.
Nice.
We also have priests signing up to ask forgiveness of queer people for the pain the church has caused.
Mm.
We're gonna have spaces for penitence, but it's us.
Yep.
We're going to be saying we're sorry. We are sorry for the
Mm-hmm.
pain the church has caused you. And
Mm-hmm.
so I would love to see those ideas spread to Pride events
Yes.
there.
Very well done. Well, of course, Randolph County doesn't have pride.
You can come with us.
We have to go somewhere else.
Come over to Durham. We'd love to have
Come
you.
to Durham. Honestly. Although we did, and I think I shared this in our group, is that, in 2019, me and my little LGBTQIA group and our allies, there was probably 10 of us, maybe 15 at the most, and we walked down the middle of our street with our big old
Good for
banner
you.
with the Proud Boys moving their little gun trucks around, and we walked.
Good for you. That is an act of bravery and resistance. Good for you.
Yes, we were all terrified. Some didn't even show up because they didn't want to do it. But I think especially now, back then, it was a big deal for me to have done that. But now I feel like I can't not do things. Everybody's like, Edge, you're gonna get a target on your back. You need to be quiet. Don't say so many things out loud. And I'm like, listen, we we we're gonna be silenced, or we can be silenced while we're speaking. And
Right.
they're gonna do what they're gonna do, but this is my brand. I am gay with God, and I cannot
Good for
not
you.
be my brand. I am who I am, and I'm not gonna hide that. It took me 30 years to figure it out, for gosh sakes. I'm not gonna hide it now.
I know that feeling, right? And
That's right.
that is where I've really come to is this sense of, you know, I- it was almost for a while I had this sense that God created me and I'm gay. And
Mm.
now I proudly say, no, God created me to be gay. This is part
Yes.
of, this is my authentic self. And
Yes.
this is who God is using for the
Yes.
ministry God wants me to be doing at this time.
Yes. Yes. And I told Father Joe one time that as far as like our trans community, I said, you know, what do you think of that? And he says, well, he goes, I don't understand. He said, I don't understand that because I'm not trans. So I don't understand how that feels to know that authentically you are someone else. And he says, I don't understand it. And he says, but I have every belief that God is working in that,
Mm.
or it wouldn't be happening. And I
Right.
said, well, would you see it as a way for um, people to have to be more compassionate toward people they don't understand? And he said, why not? If we're all created to be authentically us, then the journey that our trans brothers and sisters are going through is absolutely forcing people to come to terms with something uncomfortable for them and still
Hmm.
be love in action.
Right.
And some people can do it, and some people are still working on it.
And if there was ever a time to put that love into action for our
Yes,
trans siblings, this is it.
this is it.
This
Now's the
is the
time.
time. This is, as you very well said, this is not the time to be silent.
Nope.
This is time to stand up and let every trans person we know that God
Yeah.
loves them, and so do we.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, it's going to take a whole lot of love, so we better we better keep pouring it out there because evil has a name, and there's a lot of people who have joined. So the more we flood the world with love and joy and resilience, we'll get to the other side. I would like it to just be shorter.
I mean, me as well. Me as well. And I appreciate that, right? Because one of the things I always talk about with the beloved community, two things. One is shame and God don't live in the same space, right? And
Mm,
shame is part
mm-hmm,
of our trauma. But
mm-hmm,
the other is that I consider evil to be the absolute absence of love.
mm-hmm,
And I refuse to let that enter my body.
mm.
And it's why I pray for the person I pray for every day. I refuse
Okay,
to
I
let
I
evil
hear
enter
you,
my
God. I
body.
hear you. I hear you, God. Speaking
It's
through my beloved friend. I'll try again.
No, no, I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm just saying for me, that is one of the ways in which it's helping me, right?
But I
Is
agree
I
with you. I agree with you because rage is also a place where God does not dwell
Mhm.
inside of me. Now, not that God hasn't raged, but that I don't believe that I am as connected to the God of my understanding when I'm raging because I can't hold rage and love in the same space. And
Exactly.
anytime that I'm raging, I'm not that connected to God. Not that he's left
Exactly.
me, but I'm not that connected. So it is a work that I want for me as well. I just,
I know.
I
But what I
know.
am finding, you said this so well. What I'm finding though is the more I do that, the more my love for others is growing too.
Yes, yes. And that's what we're going for. So all of you that sat with me in the podcast where we talked about praying for our enemies, and then I told you last time that I wasn't doing so great after some of the last things that happened, but we will be resilient, and we will work again at loving others and praying for others.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
and then I'll call my buddy and say, "Help!"
And we can rage together and pray
Yeah,
together and love
okay,
together.
yeah, rage, then pray, rage, then pray. Well, Philip, this has just been the most delightful conversation, and I care deeply about you and what you're doing, and I'm so glad that we got to connect and that,
Yeah.
we haven't known each other for long and we don't know each other as well as, but that
Yes.
connection
Yes.
but that connection was definitely even like a couple of years ago. It's like, man, that this is a good guy and he's doing really good things. So I'm so proud and honored to have you on the Gay with God podcast. And I thank you so much for joining
And thank
us.
you. Thank you for having me and letting me babble on and tell my story, but I
Oh,
appreciate
we love to babble here. We just off the
it.
cuff babble all the time. So guys, we thank Philip and we thank for him for everything that he's doing. And I want you to remember that for us together, we have our own community as well. The Gay with God Facebook page is something that if you haven't joined it, yes, please join us. And then every month we do our faith journey on Zoom. And so we meet in community and we can talk about the stress of life, the love of life, the things that we're trying to deal with. And sometimes you might even hear a little sermonette from Miss Midge. So every once in a while we just, go off the rails and do what we want. So please join us. Make sure that you answer all the questions, because we do want that to be a safe space. So by you answering the questions, I'll know if you're aligned with what we're trying to do. If you are listening to this podcast and are questioning whether you can be gay and be in a relationship with the God of your understanding, if you identify as LGBTQIA+, or not even sure if you're gay, God has always been within you, even when you didn't know it. You have always been gay with God. Thank you, everybody. Stay tuned to see how you can join the Gay with God community. And as always, you are loved. I want to invite you to become a part of the Gay with God community. How can you do that? Stay connected by messaging me your thoughts and comments in the comment section under the downloads of the show on the Gay with God show page. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and share so we can increase our community outreach and be a light to those who are struggling to claim their faith. Consider being a sponsor so I can highlight your service in our community. We are all worthy of respect and a relationship with the God of our understanding. I want to thank you in advance for supporting this podcast. Together, we as a community will keep this show visible and our community stronger. Deep gratitude to my friend Tim McClendon of Tim McClendon Music for allowing me to use an excerpt from Interlude 4, a song found on his CD entitled Sundance.